Great. Okay, well, my name is Carol Cohn. I'm the director of the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights here at UMass Boston, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you in the room, as well as everybody on Zoom. Now, I'm just going to spend 2 minutes on the arc of this series. The theme of this 2-semester series is climate breakdown and the war system. Right now, there is a tremendous gap in the political and academic discussion of the root causes of the climate crisis and of the ways we might think about addressing them. With a few notable exceptions, there is a silence about the role of wars and the wider military system that makes them possible. When they do appear, it is most often within an increasingly common framing of the climate crisis as a national security threat or a threat multiplier that will create greater worldwide instability and conflict, and then militaries appear to be the obvious and natural way to respond to them, and to respond to the crisis more generally. What is nearly completely missing here is that the relationship goes in the opposite direction, that militaries and the wars they fight have a massive role in creating and exacerbating the climate crisis and other forms of ecological destruction. Militaries, and especially the US military, produce vast amounts of greenhouse gases. Even when we are at peace, they consume enormous quantities of fossil fuels and other mineral resources in their everyday operations, including basing, training, transport, and construction, and in their reliance on and support of a massive network of arms and weapon systems manufacturers. And their role in driving ecological collapse intensifies when you consider wars themselves and the vast carbon emissions generated not only by the war fighting, but also by all of the rebuilding and manufacturing needed in the post-war period. In this year's speaker series, we will explore multiple facets of this relationship between war and ecological destruction, including direct impacts of military greenhouse gases, the intensified extraction caused by the war system's demand for fossil fuels and minerals, the United States' long history of using indigenous territories and spaces inhabited by other racialized groups as environmental sacrifice zones, and the militarized violence used against land defenders and climate refugees. As the first speaker in this series, we are thrilled to have today's distinguished guest, Dr. Tiara Na'puti. Dr. Na'puti is an associate professor of global and international studies at the University of California Irvine. She is a first-generation college student who received a master's and doctorate in communication studies and a certificate in Native American and Indigenous Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. A Chamoru scholar from Guåhan, or Guam as we tend to call it here, she focuses on issues of indigenous movements, colonialism, and militarism in the Mariana Islands, Archipelago, and throughout Oceania, working with organizations addressing immigration rights and facing Native and Indigenous Pacific Islander populations. She's published widely both in academic journals, such as Academic Quarterly, American Quarterly, Environmental Communication, Security Dialogue, and the Contemporary Pacific, and also in publications aimed at a more popular and politically engaged audience, including Pacific Island Times, Latinx Spaces, and In These Times. She's currently working on editing what sounds like a really amazing book that I can't wait to read, called Detours Guåhan, a Decolonial Guide. It uses the popular guidebook and visitor brochure format to explore and interrogate the dominant narratives that structure representations of the island as the tip of the spear, or where America's day begins. The book crafts alternative itineraries and ways of, quote, visiting the island, as well as concrete examples of how we can move from metaphors of decolonization to material practices and everyday acts of resistance that bring about real change in the lives of everyday people in Guåhan. Today, Dr. Na'puti is here to present a talk entitled Resisting War and Deepening Climate Justice, Mapping Care Across Archipelagos. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Buenas on half a day. Half a day, hey. Sizus maasi pukunatan midzu estina ocasión. I wanted to open by situating place and peoples as Tautautano, or people of the land as we're called, indigenous Chamoru people of the Mariana Islands. I also pay my respects as a genuine attempt to understand the places and peoples and ways that we are meeting. To start, I am a visitor in this place. This is my first time on this campus, in these particular lands, and in these waterways. Sizus Maasi to the indigenous peoples of this place for carrying the traditions, for respecting ancestors, skies, waters, and lands. I'm so, so grateful for all of these relations. I'm really also sharing gratitude for the Massachusetts people as well, who have carried for and continue caring for their sacred lands and continue to protect it for the future. I think it's also important to start by thanking for being in this space together with me, for your time as an audience, especially as we've heard, there's been a lot of people behind the scenes making this kind of event possible. There's always lots of labor that go into coordinating not only generous sponsorships, but also the staff, the peoples here that we don't often see all the time, the people that turn on the lights and keep things running behind the scenes so that we have these wonderful privileged institutions of places to learn and unlearn and relearn. And that's really important, especially as we talk about this speaker series on this important theme of climate breakdown and the war system. I am going to engage in talk story. So I'm taking us in a canoe, a double hold canoe. We are going on a voyage together to places, all right? These places are full of stories. They have deep histories. They have genealogies that are interconnected and interwoven up with local and global structures that inform our collective work for our shared earth. More on this creation story about this slide later, okay? But that's in the Marianas. Okay. So in the depths of the Yanbaru forest, located in the northern part of the Ryukyu archipelago of Okinawa, official signs celebrating the birds known as the Yanbaru Kuina, or the Yanbaru rail, or the Okinawan rail flourish. Yet their habitat remains under constant destruction and threats from military construction. Despite the UNESCO World Heritage designation for the Yanbaru forest, these flightless birds endure noise pollution, clear cutting, and helicopter accidents, particularly near the Takai district, where the US military has established a northern training area as part of its sprawling installation to prepare troops for jungle warfare. Oh, one more back, thank you. The residents of Takai have been organizing peaceful sit-ins and protests. They face threats and civil lawsuits that were filed against them for participating in direct peaceful actions against the thunderous and dangerous V-2 Osprey helicopters. This map we can get into more later shows the area of both the Yanbaru Forest, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the overlapping training and testing grounds and the construction places for the helipad. So it's not surprising to those of us in the know that environmental designations like a World Heritage Site in the Yanbaru Forest, or even in my homelands, okay, thank you. Of Guåhan or Guam, where we have a national wildlife refuge, a US national wildlife refuge in the limestone forest of our island. They're so often actually conservation designations that are about capitalist desires for tourism and leisure in the service of the nation state. And they actually work to solidify borders and the primacy of those conservation logics that actually have little to no prior, or informed consent with the peoples of the lands that they occupy. It is precisely these places where we must and can bring and come to understand the overlapping, calculated maneuvers by which national militaries are actively occupying and destroying the very environments they purport to protect. I'm going to do some dramatic pauses throughout, if you haven't noticed. So right now the sign says here in this image on the left, refuge closed due to hazardous ocean conditions, no walking entries. Or an entry. As islands and archipelagos of and near Oceania are bearing the profound impacts of climate change, we must recognize and keep central in our actions for climate justice that these climate catastrophes are primarily caused by global military pollution. With the US military emissions being estimated at 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases since the beginning of the War on Terror in 2001, the pronounced impacts of climate change are inextricably linked to the US Department of Defense, Department of War, as the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world. So as the climate breakdown continues, the voices of our islands and our peoples and generations of resistance that have been carried lately, especially to the world's highest court. The Republic of Vanuatu and Pacific Island students fighting climate change, along with Blue Ocean Law from Guåhan, campaigned tirelessly for an International Court of Justice advisor opinion on climate change. Together, they have marked a turning point in the global climate justice movement, rooted in the lives and lived realities of our Pacific Island nations, indigenous peoples, and frontline communities. With the ICJ's landmark advisory opinion that just happened this August 2025, stating that all countries have a binding legal obligation to address global climate change, protect the climate system, and prevent and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we are celebrating what becomes possible when people embrace and understand indigenous ways of knowing that are central to the legal framework, that are deepening climate justice. I really invite you to check these stories out about those students in the Pacific that reshaped global climate law. And I wanted to spotlight how the UN General Antonio Guterres says this is a victory for our planet, for climate justice, and for the power of young people to make a difference. Also, Julian Ogden, who I'll talk more about later, wrote a lovely piece in the Rolling Stone. It's much shorter than his books, but read both. Okay, so this ruling, right? This ruling empowers nations and communities to seek reparations for climate harms caused by other states and polluters. For Oceania, it's particularly hopeful for holding the military accountable for its climate harming practices and the failure of regulation on emissions, also from corporations who pay military contractors and have all these contracts and development programs, et cetera. So as many groups are touting, there can be no climate justice without demilitarization. Today, this talk considers those interconnected stories in places like Guåhan and Okinawa. I want to put them side by side here. This map, thank you. They're the largest islands within their respective archipelagos. Both islands have historically been occupied by dominating nation states, and in both cases, their indigenous communities have resisted military violence and the war system in the ways that interweave our long historical practices of both earthly and feminist relational ethics of care. They're also trying, as I am trying, to foreground these interrelated histories, to follow the practices of contemporary indigenous writers in these archipelagos who intentionally call out to each other across distances and differences of empire's edge. And if you, okay, no, I think I got it. Thank you. Okay, right. This is, if you need a refresher, part of the base nation. This is Empire's Edge, U.S. military bases abroad, according to 2020 map. All right, next slide. Thanks. I'll try it out. I was trying to DJ, but it didn't work. Okay. So Chamoru writer and founder of Blue Ocean Law, Julian Ogden, expresses this sense of connectivity. We're back here in Guåhan right now, where 30% of our land is controlled and occupied. Julian Ogden expresses our sense of connectivity with Okinawa in a poem commemorating the battle for Okinawa that happened in 1945. Part of his poem reads, "You, who hold up more than your fair share of the sky, we reach for you. We hold your faces in our hands." Highlighting inter-island relations, Native Pacific scholar activists build their strongest challenges to colonial structures through indigenous decolonial approaches within the framework of an indigenous feminism that addresses things like the specificity of place, belonging, and our responsibilities. We Chamorros are all too familiar with struggles like those of the Okinawan communities, including specifically through our connections to bird life. We have the cocoa bird in Guåhan, also known as the Guam rail. And more broadly, our connections to deep place and deep time of island life. Chamorro historian Keith Camacho explains that there are oft-told stories of the cocoa or Guam rail as a significant symbol, particularly as it's told in the proverb of the halitai, our lizard, and the cocoa, halitai story, where these two ancestors index the lessons about honesty. They can teach us lessons about fairness, and they also convey the significance of upholding our promises and collective support within our own indigenous Chamorro culture, but also within historic and contemporary contexts. So on his cover, he has the art of the halitai, the lizard, in the foreground and the cocoa bird in the background. You don't have to read the whole book to get the story of that. But that story is important to know because it's used to teach our Chamorro values, and such as the practices that we have called tensuli, which is sort of like asserting interdependence and support in times of need or in times of celebration. And our relational value with each other of mamalau, which is about articulating the practices of respect and harmony through a code of ethical relations and actions and conduct. These values have informed our practices of our resistance to war and our commitment to climate justice. And also demands like those that we've seen at the COP and other world climate gatherings for nations and other places to decarbonize and also decolonize, demilitarize, and decriminalize. So across islands and archipelagos, there's a relational tie among these railbirds and their connection to us as indigenous peoples and other peoples of these lands. The cocoa from Guåhan and the kawina from Okinawa offer symbols of resistance and regeneration that withstand the harsh realities of militarism and the violence it brings to bear. There are many complexities of the Chamorro culture in contemporary contexts of US militarism and climate change. Among these complexities is that Guåhan remains on the 17 non-self-governing territories in the world that have yet to exercise decolonization, according to the United Nations. Also, while the United Nations notes that militarization and military occupation undermines self-determination, it remains an unfulfilled promise because the US continues militarization of our lands and lives today. With such US hyper-militarization impeding from exercising the inherent right to self-determination, it also perpetuates a culture within our communities of celebrating militarism. So our people have the highest per capita enlistment rate in the entire US, with 1 in 8 adults serving in the military, making our island's enlistment rate more than double that of the highest US state. Yet despite having this large per capita veteran population even, the US Department of Veteran Affairs offers extremely limited services on the island compared to other veterans in US states. So when it comes to the war system, make no mistake, Guåhan is considered the tip of America's spear. Our peoples, our lands are used for weapons and forever wars not of our making. Where global spending was $2.443 trillion for the military versus $1.3 trillion for climate in 2023, which makes it almost double the spending for war than climate action. The history of militarism and colonization is also a relational one. It's vexed, it's destructive as it operates among and between the islands that comprise our archipelagos. And sharing these stories, I'm trying to consider their connections of archipelagic connectivity to further advance how various forms of contemporary activism inform and resist spatial boundaries, geopolitical designations, the things that are used to justify military defense budgets, military buildup, weapons, war, training, testing, environmental destruction, and desecration. From the Marianas, the people are reaching out in solidarity and resistance to war and occupation, especially and particularly for a free Palestine. And you can follow Marianas for Palestine to learn more about these efforts worldwide. What I'm talking about and where we are right now is in this region, sometimes known as Micronesia. It's often rendered insignificant in academia, or it's profoundly absent even from written accounts of Pacific Ocean regions. Yet scholarship from here provides and resists that historical, literary, and published representation. In particular, indigenous feminist scholarship has made that correlation, of course, between violence against women, children, two-spirit, queer folks on the one hand, and the assaults against lands, waters, and peoples of planet Earth on the other. So through reconnection and restoring indigenous people's relationships with our lands, our waters, our languages, our histories, our practices, each other, these decolonial indigenous thinkers also seek to identify and dismantle violent structures that create alternatives to them. Reflecting on this idea in the 21st century of iterations of this term militarism, US imperialism and its specific expressions of colonialism, Native Pacific scholars such as Teresia Tiawa, Christine Taitano Delisle, and Ayana Ganoza provide critical analyses of military occupation as they also forward these different kinds of thought and practice. From their respective vantage points in places inundated by militarism, they identify the ways that decolonization is deferred in places like the Mariana Islands and the Ryukyu archipelago in the name of national security and readiness for war. So a range of scholars and artists have embraced the linkages between this kind of writing activism. I'll go through a couple. First is navigating Chamoru poetry. And next is the writings for Chamorros such as queer writer and interdisciplinary artist Lehua M. Taitano. And then Ariel Lowe, who articulated indigenous literature and aesthetics in her poetry book, Ocean Mother, that contribute to movements for liberation, decolonization, and self-determination. These writings also provide additional examples of mapping genealogy by recording our ancestral stories, doing what Tina Taitano Delisle describes in her book as tugi papa, an urging to write it down that centers indigeneity by respecting culture and history to challenge ongoing settler colonial power. Such efforts show the significance of locating ourselves from the places where we are writing and the kinds of relational work required to produce texts, even and despite military violence and the war system, and connect with meaningful scholarship that benefits different kinds and especially the indigenous communities. These writings offer embodied indigenous feminist resistance that particularly reassert earthly relationships and help us learn from the past, as well as ways to persist through contemporary struggles against militarization and its impact in Guåhan and on our collective planet. So the writings of queer Chamorro international human rights lawyer Julian Ogden, who I quoted earlier, also illustrate this paradigmatic practice that braids together acts of writing and deep relation-centered activism to build alliances across the region. Again, this practice stands at center in his remarks that we're commemorating the 62nd anniversary of the Battle of Okinawa back in 2007. I'm going to quote it more fully here because in 2025, it's marking the year that is the 80th anniversary of that battle. We reach for you today as you gather in memory of this bloodiest of battles. As you stand against our increasingly militarized world, demand justice, and shame the powerful with the depth of your courage and your love, know we are with you. You who know that death is only one kind of dying. You who light candles and line roadways and block trucks and boats with your bodies. You who hold up more than your fair share of the sky. We reach for you. We hold your faces in our hands. Repeating the phrase, we reach for you, Ogden reinforces activist projects by expressing deep kinship, shared values, and shared experiences and stories with the people of Okinawa. Combining word and deed, his speech act embodies a form of resistance to war systems and creates solidarity across communities that is grounded in the shared care for land, seas, and skies. He articulates how we, the people of Micronesia, the Tautautano, reach out to forge deep, caring relationships from our home and place with others who may be situated here and there. And in doing so, we learn and think and act out across our island perspectives and among archipelagic locales. Insisting upon the unity of islands and emphasizing that which actually brings us together in our regions, this forms scholarly archipelagic activism, demonstrating the collective efforts to advance and rethink the cultural and political actions, relations, and stories that powerfully connect us through vast ocean. The Marianas Trench that lies alongside our archipelago contains the deepest measured part of the planet. It is estimated that 25% of the seafloor has been mapped with sonar. 25%, with only a fraction being explored visually, and about 91% of marine life has yet to be understood. For all that power and depth and breadth of our planet, our watery, deep planet, deep sea mining is another thing on our horizon that poses unjustifiable environmental risks and harms. From significant CO2 emissions to noise and light pollution that can profoundly harm our aquatic life, and mine waste plumes that will have substantial ecological and biological impacts, it is not worth the risk to destroy our ocean ancestor and its habitats to try to save and decarbonize our society. Takai in Okinawa, Miyakojima, another island in the Ryukyus, and Guåhan, an island of the Marianas, provide further examples of archipelagic activisms that justify how deeply indigenous values and legacies are embedded in our resistance efforts in relation to our deep ocean. Okinawa is just one of several islands where the Japanese government has constructed sea or land-based ballistic missile defense and continues to occupy and desecrate indigenous lands, which I have written about elsewhere, if you want to talk about that. These actions actually raise critical questions about touted national security interests used to justify Japanese nation-state militarism within the Ryukyus. They should also make us pay attention to the situation of the US military continuing to conduct its own training and testing in Okinawa, even while it's underway with a Futenma military base relocation, ostensibly to decrease their military forces in those islands by moving them to our islands in Guåhan and the Marianas. So both these US and the Japanese national governments are continuously expanding their settler military claims to water and air for their own respective national security interests, ostensibly to defend from threats against China and North Korea. These kinds of preparations for war require ever-increasing flows of weapons and cycles of violence, which also exacerbate climate change impacts of the military. Our islands are used for weapons and warfare training that have links to the ongoing issues going with the wars in Palestine, with the Iraq War, and also with the Ukraine War. From everyday consumption of fossil fuels to forever chemicals and toxins poisoning the planet with their routine operations, the military, as the largest polluting entity on the planet, is primarily responsible for climate breakdown. So from Takai, a peace activist and friend, Mizuki Nakamura, explains that the Yanbaru forest has been used as a training field by the US military, which has been intensifying its operations over the last decade. This militarization involves clear cutting of thousands of trees and the destruction of habitats of endemic and endangered species and large quantities of military waste. In parallel fashion, the limestone forest at Litexan in the northern area of Guåhan is being destroyed by a live fire range training complex, where in our island, it's threatening the aquifer, the largest source of our fresh drinking water. As Barnabas and Ikiribati African American scholar Katarina Tiawa explains, these most recent threats to water remind us that movements are about guarding the environment, which is seen to be most crucial as a component of a Pacific existence. So from Miyakojima Island, a ground self-defense forces camp, or SDF camp, was constructed as one of Japan's newest army bases. In an all too iconic example of militarism, the camp used to be a golf course. But that tour of leisure has ended, and the place now has missiles deployed there, touted as necessary for targeting China. Military expansion on Miyakojima continues, with missile trucks on the base providing a constant reminder of the dangers of being caught in a community in the crosshairs of threats from China and also occupation by Japan. These most recent iterations of militarism and direct militarization are also threatening the water for the entire island. This is a map of Miyakojima, where an active fault line runs under the base facilities that were built to store ammunition and raw materials for missiles, such as lead and fuel oil. And this is the most active fault line among the Miyako Islands. It has a cavity that provides a robust source of groundwater. Insisting on providing a view from Oceania, when addressing decoloniality, Tiawa reminds us about activism in the Pacific by explaining how most often Pacific resistant movements are led by women and keepers of the land. And in particular, those youth who are concerned about the environment, such as the multi-sided network of Pacific Climate Warriors. Their widely popularized campaign, "We Are Not Drowning, We Are Fighting," in the face of rising sea levels and extreme weather events, constitutes a clear example of both resistance and re-existence, as described by Manola and Walsh, in terms of the redefining and re-signifying of life in the conditions of dignity. The women and youth-held movements of the Pacific are certainly evidenced throughout the Marianas and the Ryukyus. Groups such as the IWNAM, or International Women's Network Against Militarism, also rejects and resists the geopolitical framing of these islands as comprising a Pacific Rim to instead reorient the everyday discourse and continue our movements to protect economic, political, racial, and indigenous rights alongside the protection of genuine security for the environment for all. Understanding that human and non-human relations are crucially connected, there is no separation of the protection of land from the protection of water, from the protection of us. As with other indigenous movements in Okinawa, Guåhan, and globally, it is the collective stewardship of our environment that forms the foundational components of interrelated existence and reframing resistance in Oceania and among interdependent archipelagos on planet Earth. Challenging the complex way that messages and material conditions of militarism manifest throughout Oceania, IWNAM is also a community engaging in decolonial methods that conduct intersectional analyses to resist empire. They expose US colonial power as a global phenomenon that demands simultaneous critiques of militarism. Much like what Tiawa explained about resistance and re-existence, this exemplifies life. So I'm going to return us to Ogden's writing because it too offers life-affirming possibilities. In the wake of US militarization that is nothing less than cataclysmic, he writes in this beautiful book, "Life. Guam may have to bear the burden of being a colony in a world suffering from decolonization fatigue, but to be clear, her people mean to live." Providing a reminder of creative elements of indigenous action, Ogden amplifies the local archipelagic activism of groups like IWNAM. Their resistance is redefining life and the conditions of possibility for global and decolonial futures, for thinking as we have with One Love to Kai as they posted solidarity with us in Latexan. The focus of Ogden and these activists on their local community groups echoed what I discovered in July 2022 when I returned to the Ryukyus for the first time in a while. I joined women for the community groups from One Love to Kai and the Resident Society for a Helipad Free to Kai, who led me on a 2-week detour throughout the region. I'll show you some of that region on this other map we can talk about later. Including several days throughout the Ryukyus and attending meetings and peaceful actions in Miyako-jima, which is located in the Miyako Islands, around the bottom of your screen. And Ishigaki-jima, also located in the Yaeyama Islands, which is further to the left on the bottom. So my experience made clear that IWNAM and these Ryukyu groups perform a critical rethinking of islands, centered on the standpoint of indigenous ways of thinking and launching from indigenous cartographies to resist those dominant assumptions about land, place, and space. They also demonstrate the practice of deeper cultural, political, relational, and embodied caring connections with land and water to challenge those colonial and patriarchal narratives of national security. As I moved through Miyako-jima, learning about the water issues and seeing the scale of militarization, I kept thinking about the connections we have with Guåhan and our live fire training range that was threatening to put our groundwater resources under imminent danger because our northern Guam lens aquifer, which supplies 85% of our island's fresh drinking water, will soon be riddled with up to 6.7 million bullets a year. And this is a Google Earth image with the firing ranges where they're clear cutting alongside the Guam National Wildlife Refuge on the coastline. Our peaceful movements to protect water are woven into Chamoru understandings as Tautautano, people of the land, and the continued practices that we have and our values that deepen our relational reciprocal ties that maintain our protection over collective environments. Another version of the wildlife refuge. IWNAM engages in war resistance actions, just as the women I listened with and protested alongside in Miyakojima also assert their agency through their commitments to weekly peace sit-ins, to tending a community garden that is situated outside of the gate of that ground self-defense force camp that I talked about. These women provide a daily reminder of the connections with the land. They continue to farm and garden, even though there are threats of violence and accidents from military aircraft, such as the Bell Boeing V-2 Osprey helicopters, which have also been deployed worldwide from Iraq to Ukraine, despite the history of safety issues. There have been 16 accidents where Ospreys have been damaged beyond repair with fatal accidents that have killed 62 people, according to 2023 data. In Okinawa, the Yanbaru forest has been clear-cut for the destructive helipads for these V-22 Osprey, and new base construction by the Japanese government in the Ryukyus, as well as the concentration of US military bases, has been called a form of discrimination and human rights violations. Yet, both the US and the Japanese governments continue to militarize unabated. Meanwhile, in spite of all of this environmental destruction by the war system, the farmers continue gathering for peace action outside the gate. They plant and they do the laborious work of growing food for healing. It's also relational work that helps us navigate our respective struggles against militarization among and across archipelagos. Violence against the land and the water are deep traumas of environmental destruction that are palpable throughout the Oceania. And so too is the horror of desecration. As once again, militaries are desecrating our sacred cultural sites. In Guåhan, at the Marine Corps Base Camp Bloss, the newest base, which we can talk about more later, where our ancestors' remains were found, but not relayed to our community. And in Miyakojima, where ongoing militarization is disturbing and denying our ancestors. We're still in Guåhan. This is Camp Bloss. The SDF the SDF base was constructed back in Miyako Island. It was constructed upon an utaki, which is a sacred site, a long-known place for traditional Okinawan prayers. The inhabitants of Miyakojima are now denied access to the utaki behind that fence, and its land and forest was reduced from 7,300 to 4,000 square meters, while the wells were covered over to build a base. It is sacred, but it is no longer functioning as a prayer site. The Miyakojima detour showed through these community maps just how connected and similar our struggles are. Our islands and archipelagos are facing irreversible damage, and the poisoning of our environment, our relatives, ourselves, by these militaries. We continue to push for an end to these destructive activities and the desecration of our sacred places. Staying connected about what is happening across our islands and throughout our archipelagos enables us to be stronger. These are just some of the examples of archipelagic activism that helps us navigate life under US and Japanese empire. Rooted and routed in indigenous cultural practices and decolonial approaches, we're raising voices together against militarism that is so important to ensure peace for our ancestors and for our futures, as my friend Kiyomi points out here in Ishigaki Island, which looks a whole lot like Guåhan. My focus today has been to reconnect ourselves and our environments and to understand archipelagic activism from our communities as resistance to war, empire, militarism that destroy our planet. I shared these place-based stories to illustrate how decolonial frameworks challenge colonial conceptions. They challenge imposed spatial boundaries of the Ryukyu and the Mariana archipelagos. And instead of accepting those geopolitical designations of vulnerable, distant islands, territories, spaces for the war system, from the societal to the military and the technical aspects and characteristics of that system, I instead use these stories to highlight the affective elements of resistance that function for peace. and genuine security within these really expansive configurations of space across place and time. This is an important effort to engage in conversations from and across our interconnected worlds and the archipelagic spatializations that keep us all in flux on this canoe, weaving cultural practices and relationships that environments have with peoples, right? These positions help us critique the bounded, static conceptions of place that overdetermine islands and archipelagos as merely military training and testing grounds. I have considered place-based writing, experiences, stories, and broader significance beyond this region, these regions. I'm hoping to show that these are necessary in part because they're interventions that help us address the material violence of colonialism. The cocoa bird in Kuina is a land-based bird. It thrives with the land rather than soaring in the skies. The cocoa bird is endangered by the impacts of militarization that threaten our waters and lands in Guåhan. Just like our ancestors, just like the Tautautano, we are all connected, and thus we must heal and resist together. The rail bird actually adapts because it can't fly, and so it must jump into trees to sleep. It's a shy bird with a cautious personality, and sometimes it can be difficult to find the Yanbaru kuina in the wilds within Okinawa. Yet these birds persist, and so too we persist. We reach for you as we reach for each other in this peace and climate justice work that connects and orients us towards futures that are guided by our ancestors. Sidus Masi, thank you. Okay, so this is the time where I'm supposed to say a few things, but also if people need to leave, as I said at the beginning, y'all can get comfortable, move around, do your thing, but this is the time to do it without, disrupting. Because what's gonna happen next is questions and answers, comments and such, and I have a few directives. So if you're splitting, thanks so much for coming, but get out of here quietly. For those of you sticking around, please do. Here's what I'd like for people to do for a few minutes, okay? People in the room and on Zoom, we're gonna do a little Q&A workshop of sorts. If you're on the Zoom room, please type your question in the Q&A box, all right? If you're sticking around, you're near somebody or you're thinking to yourself today, turn to a neighbor or think to yourself today, do I have a question? Workshop that question. Make sure it's a real, true question, right? Or if you just want to come up with like one thing that stuck out in your mind that you want to think about or talk about from this talk. I'm going to start a little timer to keep us on track. We've got 2 to 3 minutes. One thing that stuck out to you or one question. You can develop that question with a homie. Go for it. You have some ideas marinating, percolating. So the other request, excuse me for interrupting, is that if you're in this room physically, please raise your hand if you would like to share your comment or question and wait for one of the folks to bring a microphone to you. And then one more request is that you please briefly introduce yourself before you state the thing that you would like to share with us. And then we will also be fielding some things in the Zoom Q&A. Yes. So take it away. Comment, question. You want to spotlight something brilliant someone else said since they don't want to say it? You can be a cocoa bird, but don't be too shy. Okay. Don't forget to introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Gabriel. I am a fourth year here at UMass, biochemistry major. Currently taking Anthro 220 with my professor right here. I really enjoyed your talk. I especially loved the parallels that you drew between the protection of the environmental as a way to stand against a militarization, etc. So the question that I have might be a two-parter in the sense that the whole scope between the environmental and the military is kind of wide, is kind of broad. Like if you were to truly want to impact people's perception and their ways to kind of demilitarize and like calm down or turn down the thermostat on the whole aspect of war, wouldn't it be kind of a long distance between getting them to differentiate between the environmental impact and true demilitarization? Because when I think of people enacting acts of violence through warfare, or promoting the ideas that warfare is in fact a solution that must be, that the end all be all, it's very nearsighted, and so they are more likely to be drawn to a nearsighted solution as opposed to an environmental solution, which can take years and years, and further explanation as to the anthropological implications that is connected to that. So how would you bridge the gap between those two?
Gabriel, right? Thanks for being here with the professor. So definitely getting brownie points today. I'm going to take a couple more of these. Thank you for that. I took a few notes and we'll come back around, okay? In the room in a moment, but maybe one more out here, and then one that might pop up in the room. And then it can be a comment. You can be like, wow, I want to just talk about the art and the poetry. I'm like not joking. Please, let's talk about that. There's some hidden gems in there. Hi, don't forget to introduce yourself briefly, please, and share your thing, comment or question.
My name is Colin, and this is Christina. We were talking. I'm a chemistry student, and Christina, you are a I'm sorry?
Environmental science.
Oh, hey.
Environmental science student.
All right, thank you.
And we were just kind of comparing what you were talking about with the situation in Puerto Rico, where a large portion of the landmass is actually undevelopable because there are unexploded munitions. There's a lot of like groundwater pollution, things like that. And I was just wondering if that's like a direct parallel to sort of long tail of military expansion and use of land, or if that's like a different situation entirely, just because I was less familiar with what's going on in Guam and other archipelagos.
Okay,
I'm just wondering if you could maybe talk on that.
cool. Thanks for calling, doing that and volunteering. Your co-conspirator there. All right, maybe one in the Zoom room, or anybody like
Yes,
itching
I do
for the
have
mic?
one on Zoom. Can
Okay.
you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. We have a question from our attendee, Anne Runyon, who asks, with so many militarized men and veteran in Guam, but with few veteran services, are there tensions between Indigenous women's resistances to militarism and active and former Indigenous military personnel? And how may these tensions be lessened or lessening?
Half a day and Runyon sneaking into the Zoom. Miss you. Okay, thank you for all of those. I think I'm gonna start in Puerto Rico and then move around. And then while that's happening, again, feel comfortable, do your thing, move about. So Puerto Rico is a different kind of case in terms of its U.S. territorial status than the U.S. territorial status of Guåhan or Guam, which is also different than the way that the rest of our islands in the archipelago are grouped politically. So it's to shorten it, it's a hot mess of colonialism and U.S. nation-state occupation in those islands and throughout a lot of the islands that exist in other parts of the world. What I will say is that unfortunately, with the desecration and the destruction and the pollution that has happened in places like Puerto Rico, because I'm thinking of Vieques, I'm thinking of the way that you mentioned unexploded ordinances, or the way it's the acronym is UXOs, like those have then been used to sort of be a present in some ways, to be a little glib about it, to give land back. The military has given land back to communities, but often that land is so polluted, so poisoned that it is unsafe or dangerous, or even just like the question mark about whether or not or how to use the land. So much of why I try to tack back and move through, and I hope y'all didn't get seasick on our little canoe experiment, but like, this is heavy and overwhelming stuff. And it's an inundation, and it's a consistency, and it's a constant. Just this morning, I read about some other kind of toxin I never even heard of that is happening in another northern village that I didn't even get to talk about today, in one spot, in one island, that will never go away, okay? So I think it is parallel in some ways. If we think about the war system and the US military in particular's use of that sort of settler strategy of settler militarism, right? So the craziness, that's not very crazy, but the sort of way that the military has been kind of promoting itself now as a server and protector of the environments, as I mentioned, pins up against a lot of these protected areas, including marine protected monuments and those kinds of areas. And so I do think it's kind of tricky because we've received some land back in our community that is not safe. And yet I think that's part of the healing process that we learned from in all these other places, right? We've seen this with our comrades in Hawaii as well for a long time, that it's important to work together to figure this out. Because actually the US military, the US nation state, that particular empire is young. It's pretty boring. The creative possibilities of our people that start at this foundation rock, our creation story that comes from thousands and thousands of years ago, the stories that said that our relationships with each other as siblings create our planet and our world, so much more expansive, right? The way that it's depicted in this really beautiful mural here by Joey Certeza that I just kind of splashed across this image of these strong women who are facing their future by looking at our ancestors, our creation rock, Fua, right? All of that is much more creative. So I think that that's one way to kind of get at it. But unexploded ordinances like stop roads, right? Like just this summer in Guåhan, there were places where there might be some. And so we don't know if we can go in that area. So that's complicated. And I moved a little bit away from your question, but part of it kind of gets me to what Anne was saying and a little bit maybe of what you were saying, Gabriel, which is that there are so many military service members in Guåhan that return. There are also so many that move away, okay? Like most of our indigenous communities, like many indigenous communities do not live in their traditional homelands. And so of the ones that return or of the ones that are in Guåhan and don't have those access to services, I haven't yet, to be specific, heard about that question about tensions between like indigenous feminist women's organizing versus like the men that are returning from, or seeking veteran services. There was something else more eloquent in Anne's question to the bottom part, and I forgot what it was. Are there tensions between indigenous women and something else? Organizing?
And active and former indigenous military personnel.
And active and former indigenous military personnel. It's a very good point. So a lot of our communities who are indigenous in Chamoru or other like communities are involved in the military, and some of them are the strongest voices for this peaceful efforts because they've seen what's been done to their lands, right? They've experienced issues where they find out later that they were cleaning toxic ships, for example, that came from the Marshall Islands after nuclear testing and training that came to our islands without our knowing that that was what was happening, right? It's very expensive also because it's a US territory to fly back to the US nation state or most anywhere. And so that also exacerbates the issues because critical services for veterans, for example, the closest place is Hawaii, which was, if you're in Guåhan, that means an 8-hour flight across our open ocean and an international price tag. So I think that really kind of also gets into some of the things that we have to think about this nearsighted, farsighted thing. I think I was catching what you were talking about, Gabriel, which is that like, yes, the scope of the environment and protecting it and the military is super wide and broad. There would be some really great ways to impact perception. I hope to show throughout my talk a lot of different examples about how peoples, despite all of this, are still impacting perception. That live fire training range, unfortunately, it is underway right now in the northern area of Guåhan at Letexan, where I showed you that Google Earth map, where the clear cutting was happening. The helipad construction did conclude in Takai. So on one side, there is the UNESCO World Heritage Site in the northern part of Okinawa, and on the other side, there is these very dangerous V2 Osprey helipad landing areas. And yet it was the people of Takai that were taking me around these other islands and saying, look at the gardens, look at the way we're coming together, look at the art, listen to this poetry, look at the peace monument that they were in Miyako Island, the very first peoples of any part of the world to create a peace monument towards what's considered or called comfort women of the Korean War. And they had a plaque in the language of every country or place, because they included Guåhan, even though it's not a country. They had a plaque with any country or place that had been involved in the Korean War and that kind of violence in Miyako-jima, because they said, we're going to create the peace. We're going to do it our way. So short-sighted, long-sighted, I mean, the earth has been around for a minute. We humans are mere literal mortals. We know, I showed that deep sea mining and talked about how little we know about the ocean. I tried to emphasize and put a little pause there that like, we don't even know how deep the ocean is. We've only measured so far, right? So who are we to think that we know better than our planet, the ancestor that continues its cycles. Thank goodness for the sunshine today, right? We still got air to breathe. And so through that, I think those creative possibilities were where we're going to find more of maybe the short term, long term. I think in your expertise or in your gaining expertise, it might be helpful for us to not necessarily worry about some of the short term gains, because in some ways, that differs from us paying attention to thinking of our future generations that, you know, we want to hold for the environment. And so that's why we have things like the lawsuit against, you know, in the highest court of the world, right? We also have the local level stuff going on. We have the behind the scenes things. We have people who go to the United Nations. We have people who hate the United Nations, never go, but do their own thing to also, right, educate and advocate outside of that construct. So here for it all. They're inundating in their way, which is very systematic. I think the jumbling creative possibilities and the poetry and the art and the music and the different kinds of ways of getting at it alongside some of these legal structures, and also bringing in those values into the existing structure. Because it's kind of like universities. I'm sorry that you all had a SWAT team here recently. That is horrible. And as somebody coming from UC Irvine, where there were militarized police on our campus for peaceful protesting, it is about decriminalization. It's got to be about demilitarization and decarbonization. And our institutions and the very sites of learning have the best way to dismantle that kind of strategic ignorance that Catherine Letts talks about. The less we know about the military, the easier it is for them to do these things, right? Just imagine if they decreased 1% of that multiple trillions that they're using and moved it into something else for a greater good. I went way off track. Okay, any other comments or questions? Poets in the room that would just want to say something. I know I keep talking about poetry, but you can say whatever. I don't know where our microphone went, and I don't even know the time, so maybe I should. Yeah, oh, I see. Okay, thank you. Hand there. Thank you. If you don't mind the brief intro, and then, yeah, hi. Off days. Yeah. Yeah,
Yes,
I hear it.
We met a decade ago at ASAO.
Yeah.
My name is Ping Ann, Pingy. I do work in Tonga.
Yeah.
I just want to say, Malay Lava, Malau Pito Koho, Leo. And I noticed a couple of young Tongan women in your presentation, which made me very excited from their clothes. So I find myself wondering about, given this statistic that Guåhan has the largest per capita enlistment into the US military of any state or territory, I'm really interested in, is that also that sort of highest signing on to be an activist, to be part of this movement? What are which are the Pacific nations that are leading, and which are the ones that are, you know, still kind of ramping up? And I sort of ask this in part because I also do work in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, and when I'm there, I don't hear as much about these issues as I hear in the smaller islands. So I'm just sort of really interested in sort of how that all kind of plays out, because when I get into conversations with folks, including sort of some of my Tongan relatives, sometimes it doesn't always register the urgency that you're talking about. And I wonder if that's because the islands are larger and a little further away from this particular epicenter of US militarization. It doesn't, even that might be the case, but that doesn't change the fact of the urgency that it's all one ocean, it's all one earth, it's all one ancestor, right? And we're all related to her and beholden to her, and obligated to at least, like, how does that sort of play out? It's an odd question, but I mean,
I was trying to get back to the slide. Thank you for that. And maybe we'll take another comment from the Q&A, but I was trying to get back to the slide that's right before the Rolling Stones one. I couldn't see if you could tell my whole slide deck. You might have to go back a lot. It's kind of towards the beginning. Oh, 3 questions on Zoom. So what does that math mean? One more question, and then that's it? Oh, okay, that one. Sorry, yes, next. Thank you. So yes, these are students from Tonga attending the university who were attending the University of the South Pacific when in 2019, an environmental law professor encouraged his class to draft a letter. So do your homework, y'all. Please take it to the highest court if you want. No, they already did it for you, but keep up with this, right? And I appreciate the question. We're going to take the one on Zoom. I know there was a lot more to talk about, so hopefully maybe we can chat more if I don't get to some of what you said. You want to take the other one on Zoom?
I've got a couple on Zoom, so I'll just go through them briefly. So the first one is from Madara Melnica, who asks, do you believe in the chances of green militarization? As long as there are threats caused by other countries, including Russia, it seems likely that the USA and NATO will reduce their power. Of course, this is a vicious circle. However, some scientists urge the military to at least transform its approaches if it wants to pursue these actions. So I suppose your thoughts on green militarism. And then we also have a question from Marina Rudenko, who is studying the gendered impact of Russian aggression against Ukraine on the environment and climate change, and mentions the vast environmental destruction caused by it, including the emission of 55 million tons of CO2 equivalent during the third year of the war. So in a situation of resistance and life-saving, Ukrainians can't talk about anti-militarism. I have never heard the calls to Russia to stop aggression because it ruined the global climate. Have you ever heard such calls to Russia?
Okay, big questions. And thank you all for rolling with me. I'm on a time crunch, so if I miss something, we'll check later, or that obligatory slide that says I have a job, you can find me that way, okay? So do I believe in the chances of green militarization? I'm just gonna grab that really quick. Not really. I don't believe in an unethical, racist, and violent institution to do the right thing. I've been waiting for a while, so have my ancestors. It hasn't happened yet. So what I will say is that some of the ways that the military has been using their arguments about how they're good for the environment is they point to these really sustainable initiatives that they have. And trust, they have resources. So they do some good. It is a drop, barely a drop, a pipette droplet, I don't know, in the bucket compared to the kinds of damage that I've already showcased and many other much smarter people have put together with the literal numbers and receipts to show the damage they've done of what we can get because they don't have to disclose it. So when I hear about green militarization or green militarism, it's no shade to the person that asked the question. I also don't really think that NATO is going to maybe do as much when they're talking about the military decreasing emissions. I think a lot of that is sort of, they've had a sustainability strategy for a long time. The military has. It's been written about in whole books that talk about the militarization of the environment. And I think that one of the things that is happening with this idea of green militarization is that, at least what I've seen, is they want to make like the idea of greening in the military sense is like, actually, yes, we could decrease military emissions of the V-2 Osprey helicopter. Let's figure out how to go electric with that thing. They're not trying to take it apart. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. In the room, sorry, Zoom. I don't know if you can still see me. I'm throwing shade. I don't really believe that green militarization is going to happen because of the ways that we've seen them kind of upgrade the faster flights, the fleets, like kind of upgrading the fleets for their continued purposes without changing their mission. I also know that you talked about threat multipliers, which is a whole other thing about how the military actually only cares about, for the most part, climate change problems like sea level rise, when it's like sea level rise is a threat to our bases. So we don't like climate change, so we'll take care of climate change. You said it much more eloquently. Thank you so much, Carol. It's flipped. It's actually the other way around. Unfortunately, I haven't really heard many calls for Russia to deal with their military emissions and the way. I did not know that is an overwhelming statistic, Marina. Thank you for bringing that to my attention about something like 55 million tons of greenhouse gases in Ukraine. It's horrific. I think we're going to need to, as civil society, from wherever we are, figure out how we can be in support of these kinds of efforts around the world. Because as what we're seeing is, it doesn't matter where the war is or the preparations for the war are coming from, we know that it has a lot of funding, we know that it has a lot of power behind it institutionally, and we know that it doesn't have a lot of creativity. It's kind of the same system and structure, and so if we understand that, there's some different ways that we can break down to prevent the climate breakdown. Sis, I don't know if I can talk about your big question right now. Can we talk a little later? I do think your question about Pacific nations that are leading is really important. I think some of parts of Oceania are more kind of at the forefront of these bigger global governmental discussions, including the COPE meetings. I think there's a lot of things happening sort of behind the scenes, since a lot of the Pacifica groups do not have formal representation in the places that make those decisions. But I hear you that some of them, without seeing those like literal effects of militarization on their islands or among their communities, they don't necessarily have that same sense of urgency unless, you know, it's a little bit more dire, like in Vanuatu, right? Like in the Marshalls, in other parts of Micronesia, right? And we have it a little bit different in each place, which is why it's so important to connect these islands and to think archipelagically, and then to get other places that aren't thinking about islands or archipelagos at all to listen to us. Okay, I kind of took it on, but more to that maybe. It's so nice to see you, and thank you for reminding me of our connections. ASAO, that was so long ago. Go to conferences, make friends. Okay. Are we at time, Carol, or should you shut me up now? Is this how it goes? I don't know. Oh, okay, one more.
Yeah, I have another one on Zoom, also from Madara Melnica, who asks, how would you value the capacities of U.S. courts to respond to these human rights violations? There have been several court cases, including on Or.Dump. Likewise, Palau teenagers submitted a claim in front of UN mechanisms.
Oh, those Palauan youth. They get me every time. Amazing. I love that our people are taking it to the US courts. I think that the US courts do have a responsibility to deal with. Thank you for bringing up the Or.Dump. In the island of Guåhan, the Or.Dump is one of our several Superfund sites, which is what like the Environmental Protection Agency considers to be like the most toxic sites. And it's one of them. And it was actually started as the naval military dump. And so I think in some ways it's always important to try to use the weapons and the tools. Don't like to use a metaphor like that. It's important to use the tools that we have at our disposal, even though I just said I don't think it's likely that unethical institutions are going to do the right thing, but sometimes they do. And the US courts are also a court system. The legal system in general was not made for us. And so I think that it's really great that the Palauan youth have brought up these issues to U.S. courts. I think there are lots of different ways that ongoing court cases are at least moving the needle. So here's an example. The live fire training range, as devastating as it is, as close as it is to our aquifer, as close as it is to Letexen, our sacred place for stirring waters, it's not in another place where the US military originally proposed it. And through people making comments during the environmental impact statement process, through lawsuits that they raised against the US Department of Defense and the Department of the Navy entity within that, it pushed things back. It's been over a decade since they proposed to do this build up the way it was planned. And I think learning from the longstanding peaceful movements that we've seen in places like Okinawa, which have taught us a lot about how they don't want that militarization there in those islands any more than they want it in our islands. And we learn from each other across that. I also believe that like US courts are one tool. We got to use all the tools. And so hopefully something comes from those efforts. But yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. Why don't you just stay there for a minute? Thank you for this wonderful, illuminating, important talk. For any of you who want to see it again or tell your friends about it, the video will be available on the consortium's website and on our YouTube channel. And a final reminder that we'd really appreciate your feedback if you look at those feedback forms. And we hope that you will come to the other talks in this series, which you can see right there, the ones in this semester. So this has been an amazing opportunity to listen to you and to learn from you. Thank you so much for being here with us. We are really great.
Thanks for having me. Get out of here. Yeah. I actually don't know. What's happening? Is class over? Class dismissed? Okay. All right. Take care.